We have spent a lot of time on factorizing formulas, and now we will see why. The reason is that whenever we have a product, a multiplication, of which the result is 0, we know something about the factors of that multiplication. The rule is if a product of multiple numbers is 0, then one of those numbers has to be 0. So let's see how that comes about. What if I tell you that p times 5 equals 0? Then what can you conclude about p? Well, you've probably figured out intuitively that p has to be 0. Any other number is just not going to work. And similarly, if I tell you that minus 4 times some number q equals 0, then you can conclude that q itself must be 0. So what if I tell you that a times b equals 0? What follows from this? Well, they could both be 0. 0 times 0 is 0. But they don't have to. In fact, if a is already 0, then b can just be any number. And if b is 0, then a can be any number. But at least one of them has got to be 0. So if we see that a times b is 0, we can conclude that a is 0 or b is 0, or maybe both. But in mathematics, whenever we say a or b, we mean a or b or maybe both. So we're just saying that at least one of these numbers has to be 0. Now, instead of a and b, we could have used more complicated factors. For instance, I could tell you that x multiplied by the factor x minus 2 equals 0. Now, what can we conclude? Again, we have a multiplication of two factors, x and x minus 2. The result is 0, so at least one of these two factors has got to be 0. So my conclusion is x must be 0 or x minus 2 must be 0. Now, when we solve an equation, we usually don't stop until we know precisely what x is. So for the first option, x equals 0, we know what x is. X is just 0. But for the second option, x minus 2 is 0, we're not done yet. We need to figure out what x is. But that's easy. We just have a very small linear equation here. It says x minus 2 is 0. Now, what does x need to be for x minus 2 to be 0? Either you see the answer immediately, or else we can just add the number 2 to both sides, and then we get x on the left side and 2 on the right side. So the answer is x equals 2. So it turns out to this equation, there are two solutions. Either x is 0 or x equals 2. And we can use this principle whenever we have a product whose result is 0. For example, x minus 3 times x plus 4 equals 0 is a product of two factors, x minus 3 and x plus 4. So the first option is that x minus 3 is 0, and the alternative answer is that x plus 4 is 0. In the first case, we have a small linear equation here. X minus 3 is 0, so x has to be 3. In the second case, x plus 4 is 0. The only number that fits here is minus 4, right? We subtract 4 on both sides, so we get x equals minus 4. So these are our two solutions to this equation. Another example, again, a product of two factors, 4x multiplied by x minus 7, and the result is 0. So that means that one of these two factors has to be 0. So either 4x has to be 0, or x minus 7 has to be 0. And now we can look at both of these equations separately. In the first case, 4x equals 0. What is x? Well, we divide both sides by 4, and then we see x equals 0. In the second case, x minus 7 equals 0. So we add 7 on both sides, and we get x equals 7. So there are two solutions, x equals 0 or x equals 7. Final example. First factor, 2x minus 1. Second factor, 4x plus 8. And the result is 0. So we can conclude that either this factor is 0 or else this factor is 0. So 2x minus 1 is 0, or 4x plus 8 is 0. These linear equations are a bit more complicated, but still it's relatively easy to solve them. In this case, we add 1 on both sides, so we get 2x equals 1, and then we divide by 2 to get x equals 1/2. And in this case, we have to subtract 8, so that we get 4x equals minus 8, and then we divide by 4, so that we get x equals minus 2. So these are the two solutions to our equation, x is 1/2 or x is minus 2. Now pause the video and see if you can do these by yourself. And let's look at the solutions. We have two factors here, 5x and x minus 5. So 5x equals 0 or x minus 5 equals 0. In this case, x is just 0, and in this case, x is 5. Here, two factors, either x plus 8 is 0 or x minus 1 is 0. In the first case, x has to be minus 8. In the second case, x has to be 1. And here, 2x plus 8 times x minus 1 is 0. So this factor is 0, or this factor is 0. In the first case, subtract 8 on both sides, 2x is minus 8, and then x has to be minus 4, divided by 2. And in this case, add 1 to both sides, and you get x is 1. So our solutions are x is minus 4 and x is 1. So we now know what to do when we have an equation that is basically a product with result 0. And we also know from the earlier videos that we can often factorize sums of 2 or 3 terms. So we can write them as a product. So now we only need to bring these techniques together in order to be able to solve quadratic equations. And that's what we will do in the next video.